Hello, sweet friends. Welcome back. I'm Dr. Vanessa Calderón, and we are talking about something today that is going to make you a much more effective leader, and it's going to it's going to ensure that you are creating a sustainable business. So, what we're talking about today are boundaries. Now, in my experience, there are two schools of thought here when it comes to boundaries, when I've been teaching this to folks. There are folks who think they know everything about boundaries. I'm all good. I've got it. I don't need to talk about this. Boundaries are for weak people. If that is you, hold on, stick around. My sense is you might learn something today. And then there's the other school of thought, which is like, yes, boundaries really matter, but they're so hard for me. They've always been so hard for me. Please teach me how to set a boundary. So, no matter where you are today on that spectrum of thinking you might know everything or feeling like you can never set a boundary, my sense is you're going to learn something today that you will start being able to apply right after this podcast episode to really support you in creating boundaries. And here's the thing that in my experience, when folks start to set boundaries, usually they're afraid because what if it makes them less effective? But what they learn is that it actually it like rocket fuels their effectiveness. It makes them more aligned and they are just so much happier when they set boundaries. Okay, so let's get into it. What are we covering today? We're going to talk about what boundaries are, mainly because I want to talk about what they're not, because I think there's some confusion here about what a boundary is and what it isn't. We're going to talk about how they actually make you a more effective leader. And I'm going to jump into the science a little bit, what's happening to your brain, to your body when you set boundaries, and how it's actually supporting you in being more creative and making you more effective. And then I'm going to talk about why it's so hard. What are the most common reasons that people really struggle with this, and how we can start practicing really effective boundaries today? All right, let's jump in. What are boundaries? So, boundaries are sort of these like invisible or energetic lines that define what is okay and what is not okay when it comes to our time, our energy, and our relationships. They're sort of these rules of engagement that we can set to clarify how we expect to be treated and how we expect to treat ourselves. That is really, really, really important because the thing about boundaries is this: if you set a boundary, but you don't respect it for yourself, nobody will respect a boundary that you do not respect. So I like to think of boundaries also as this way to stay whole. It's a way to ensure that you are living aligned with your values. It's a way to ensure that you are showing up and always giving your best self because you know how you show up when you're exhausted, when you're tired, when you're underslept, when you're hungry. Boundaries also increase our career longevity, our overall fulfillment in life, and boundaries are a way to show unconditional love. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is you can set a boundary, and if you've never set a boundary before, it might be really uncomfortable, not just to you, but to now the people around you who are used to interacting with you in a specific dynamic, because now you are interrupting that dynamic when you set a boundary. And the reason why I say it's a way to show unconditional love, because even if it's uncomfortable for them to respect your boundary, you get to let it be uncomfortable for them and love them anyway. When I was first practicing boundaries, especially personal boundaries with relationships, oh my gosh, it was so uncomfortable. But it really served me to continue to lean into unconditional love because if people were angry, upset, I just got to love them anyway. I got to say, that's okay. I love you anyway, because I know you being angry and upset is not necessarily about me. It's because we're disrupting an old habit, an old pattern that's been around for a long time. And disrupting patterns can be uncomfortable for people, especially when those patterns have served them, when those boundaries meant that you were giving much more of your time, much more of your energy, and there was a mismatch of energy. In those instances, especially in relationships that have not been reciprocal, when you set a boundary, people are not gonna like it sometimes, and they will get used to it, I promise you. And that is just what gets to happen when we start practicing boundaries in the beginning. So, what are they not? And I think the most important thing here is that boundaries are not meant to be rigid. They are not meant to be some rigid wall that isolates you away from everybody else. And When people first start practicing boundaries, especially if you don't have a history of practicing boundaries or saying no, or if you have a history of people pleasing, when you start to set a boundary in the beginning, you are very proud of yourself and you're like, yes, I'm going to set this boundary. This has been my example with the folks that I coach. And what ends up happening is if they can't respect that boundary 100% of the time, they get really mad at themselves. I'm so upset. I set this boundary. I can never respect my boundaries. People don't understand. And it's important just to see that pattern because boundaries are not meant to, they're not meant to be rigid. They're meant to flow. When you set them, especially in the beginning, you get to just pilot. It's like a pilot. You get to pilot them. You get to see what works, what doesn't work, what are you going to hold on to, what are you going to release, and you get to let them be fluid. So especially in the beginning, when you're using them, you get to just try them on, see what's working and what's not working. And boundaries are not a way of controlling other people. They're not a way to manipulate others to do what you want them to do. It's not like you better do this or else. Nope. It's like, listen, this is the boundary that I have. This is this is kind of a wild example, but let me see if I can get the point across. What I mean by this is you can very lovingly say, hey, we don't take guests after 8 p.m. at our house. And then you have a family member that shows up and is knocking at the door and it's 8:15 and, just an uncle or whatever. And you're like, hey, we don't take guests after 8 o'clock, but let me check in on them. Are they okay? All right. So they're good. You checked in, you let them in, you let them go. And then you say, okay, just so you know, we don't take guests after 8 o'clock. So next time you're going to come over, please come over before 8. A few days, weeks go by, the same person comes back knocking on the door. You can say, hey, sorry, like we're asleep. We're not opening the door. We don't take guests after 8 o'clock. They might get angry. They may get upset. What do you mean? And, they look good. They look fine. They're in a fine mental state, but you don't open the door. So that's a way to say, hey, I love you anyway. Come back tomorrow. We're here, and you don't open the door. Now, the opposite of that could be, hey, if you show up after 8 o'clock, I'm going to be so upset and I'm never going to talk to you again. That is about manipulating, coercing, and trying to control the person's behavior. So I give sort of that like wild example, mainly to drive the point home about the energetic difference between setting a boundary to protect your sacred energy versus setting a boundary to manipulate other people. I think you get the point. So why does this matter? This matters because boundaries are all about what you will do for yourself to care for yourself. Boundaries are rooted in self-responsibility because it is your responsibility to take care of your sacred energy. And by the way, how you show up, what you create in the world, the impact you have in the world is 100%, determined by the energy that you're bringing into that. And that's why it's so important to protect your sacred energy. So it's all about being responsible, not about behaving, not about controlling somebody else's behavior or punishing them or manipulating them. It has nothing to do with that. I like what Brene Brown says. Brene Brown says that being clear is being kind, and being unclear is being unkind. And boundaries make things clear, which means they're an act of kindness. Boundaries are an act of kindness. So, how do boundaries make you a more effective leader? Let's jump into this for a little bit. So, in my experience, when I coach the leaders and entrepreneurs that I work with, most of them are afraid to set boundaries because they think it's going to make them less effective, less successful, or they're going to make less money. And I just want to get this out now that setting boundaries will not make you less effective. It's not going to make you less approachable. That's one I hear a lot. Like, I want people to know that I'm approachable. But setting a boundary isn't going to make you less approachable. It's not going to make you less compassionate or less dedicated, and it's not going to make you less money. What it will do, though, is it will ensure that people know that you are reliable, that you are trustworthy, and it will ensure that you have sustainable energy to move you through the future. So, what does this mean? So, how does it make you more effective? So, in order for you to stay in your zone of genius, instead of leaking energy all over the place, it's important for you to set boundaries. Now, boundaries also let your teams and your clients know what is allowed, what's allowed for you and what's not allowed for you. They protect your mental bandwidth, which I consider as part of your sacred energy, your mental bandwidth. So I'm going to talk about what's actually happening here in the brain, okay, and how boundaries support you. So the part of the brain that's responsible for making decisions, for making, even if the decision is like, how am I gonna respond to this email? Or, what program am I gonna launch next? I have to have a difficult conversation and counsel somebody. So the part of the brain that's responsible for these types of decisions, for the most part, is the prefrontal cortex, the PFC. And the prefrontal cortex is incredibly effective at making these really big decisions. It's really good at weighing options, at being creative, at thinking critically. However, the prefrontal cortex is also incredibly energy intensive. It burns through the resources that it needs at a really high metabolic load. Those resources typically are just glucose and oxygen, or primarily glucose and oxygen, but it burns through those really quickly. So the more decisions that you have to make, especially whenever you're not well rested, and in my experience, most of the leaders and entrepreneurs I coach are chronically under rested. So the more decisions you have to make, the more mentally fatigued you will become, which means your decisions are going to become less and less effective throughout the day. So what this looks like in practice is if you are spending a lot of your mental bandwidth in, making decisions that are not really high level decisions, like how many emails do I have to respond to, or, if you're an entrepreneur, you're an online content creator, you may be thinking about how I wordsmith this LinkedIn post or this Instagram post, and you're spending a lot of energy on that. What you're going to find is that it's going to be harder for you to focus later on maybe a difficult conversation you have to have, or a team meeting or strategic planning session, and you're going to become less effective, which means you're more likely to make an impulsive decision. You're more likely to avoid the decision altogether. And that's fascinating. I find this so interesting. I had a client once who was, man, she's so brilliant. She was a mom of three kids, and she also led a private pediatric practice. She was the owner and a physician there, but also the owner, and had doctors that worked under her. And she was constantly making decisions about everything. So she came to me because she just felt exhausted, overwhelmed, and she didn't want to leave her practice. She loved her practice, but she had three young kids and she was trying to do all of this and she felt really overwhelmed. And what was so interesting is she came to me because she thought she just needed to be more productive. She just needs tools to be more productive. And what we realized is the problem wasn't productivity. She was hyper functioning person, super productive, everything calendared out, planned to like the second of the day. That was not her problem. Her problem was that she didn't set boundaries. She was making so many decisions that people on her team could make. She was trying to, over plan for her kids when she had hired all this support at home to help her with her kids. She was still trying to get involved with like, oh, did you drop them off here? Did you do this? What about the home? All these little things that were all getting done, but she was just wanting to make sure that everything was getting done. And so she was on top of everything, so much so that she was exhausted by the end of the day. And she said the way it would show up sometimes is that her husband would say, hey, what should we do for dinner on Friday night? And she would sometimes just snap at him. Can't you just make this decision for yourself? She had decision fatigue. She was mentally exhausted. And so that makes sense, right? And so what we want to do is we want to avoid that. And how we do that is by thinking strategically and smartly about what decisions actually require our high level brain. So if you are the CEO, what decisions require the CEO brain? If you are, the operations expert, what decisions require your brain versus somebody else's brain? And so we want to make sure that we do that because, again, if we don't, what ends up happening is we become exhausted. We experience what's called decision fatigue. So, this is how decision fatigue shows up. And the decisions we end up making, we default to decisions that are easier or reflexive or something that we sort of perceive as being safer, even if it's not the most ideal decision. And you're more likely to get irritable when that happens. So, what we want to do is we want to avoid that. And the way we avoid that is by being thoughtful and setting boundaries ahead of time. All right. So, why is it that we struggle to set boundaries? So, I'm just going to be honest. For most of us, we struggle to set boundaries because we're afraid. We're afraid to set boundaries. Why? Why are we afraid? We're afraid because what if we make somebody mad? What if we disappoint somebody? What if somebody was expecting us to do something and now we're letting them down? So, in my experience, is usually something like that. We don't want to be perceived as not a team player. We don't want to be perceived as working less hard. And we definitely don't want to disappoint anybody. High functioning folks, especially those that have really thrived on external validation, which in my experience is so many of us, probably 90% of my people that are listening right now. If you have thrived on external validation, setting boundaries can feel like a threat. It can feel really unsafe. And I don't, so in my experience, folks do not connect those dots. When I'm coaching them, they don't connect the dots that I'm not setting a boundary because I'm afraid. They just say, I don't want to set a boundary because I'm supposed to do this, or this is how I'm going to be successful. Or some people do say, I feel guilty. I feel guilty when I set a boundary. It's interesting because I think, some of the programming that we've been taught in sort of Western society is that good people are selfless, good people are generous, and good people are available 24/7. And if you grew up in an environment where love was earned through people pleasing, through making other people happy, or through performance, then of course setting a boundary is going to be really hard. You might also carry a cultural response. So, for example, I had a client that was from Iran. Oh my gosh, nicest guy. He was leading this big team and he had some colleagues that were at his level and the people that they directed to. It was so interesting. When they were asked to do something, he'd always volunteer because in his culture, they placed a huge value on being generous, on being supportive, on giving of your time. And it was fine when he had the bandwidth, but what started to happen to him, he started to notice that he was the only one ever volunteering to take on the extra work. And so he started becoming resentful. And coming from a place of resentment is not a great purposeful place to come from because it's not going to give you intentional outcomes, when you're making choices out of resentment. And so he started realizing like, holy smokes, I need to really think about this. Like, why am I the only one doing this? Because in his mind, everyone would be volunteering if they could. But what he realized is people weren't because he was always raising his hand. So nobody else ever thought that they needed to do it. They never raised their hand because they always thought, oh, he'll do it. Oh, he'll pick it up. And that led to resentment. So that's sort of this cultural response that we might have. And that's something that we all need to examine for ourselves. Is this something that I do? If so, why? And is this something I want to continue to do? And maybe the answer is yes. And if it's yes, look, notice what's happening, notice the outcomes of that. And if you like the outcomes, great. But if you don't like the outcomes, then maybe this is something you examine. The other big reason why we don't do this is a trauma response. Maybe you have people-pleasing tendencies that were bore out from a trauma response or overworking or perfectionism. For all of those reasons, we might be really afraid to set boundaries. And in my experience in the entrepreneurial world, when I coach all my entrepreneurial clients, especially when they're first starting out as a business owner, there's so much eagerness to be successful that there's this tendency to work really, really, really hard to say yes to a ton of opportunities. And there's just, there's a lack of being thoughtful about boundaries because there's so much fear that if I set a boundary, I'm going to miss out on this opportunity. And then we have FOMO and then we don't want to fail. But what ends up happening is you just end up offering your clients, you'll end up offering your business all of your leftovers because there's no energy left to create this beautiful product. It's like it's like you offer everybody these like cold leftovers energetic instead of offering them this beautiful like warm signature delicious dish that you could have created had you set boundaries and had you had the mental bandwidth to do it. All right, so we talked about what boundaries are not, why they are hard to set. One thing that I think is so interesting too when it comes to why they are hard to set that I want to name is this is so fascinating. I have come to see that really smart folks, all of you that are listening, when I name certain things like what boundaries are easy for you to set, I hear things like, oh, things that have to do with like moral boundaries. I won't steal, I won't cheat, I'm going to be faithful to my significant other. Those types of things are easy. But the boundaries that are more difficult are like professional boundaries or boundaries that feel like I think I'm supposed to do this because it's supposed to make me a good person, like overworking or always saying yes to these family requests and not setting healthy family boundaries. It's so fascinating to me. And so I just want to name that because my sense is you can probably relate if you're someone that struggles with setting boundaries, or maybe you think you're good at setting boundaries. If you think you're good, just notice, is there anywhere in my life where, maybe I could benefit from setting a boundary? If that's the case, just notice and see what comes up for you. So if you are concerned or afraid to set boundaries, here's one more question I have for you before we move on. What are you afraid will happen if you set a boundary? What are you afraid will happen if you don't honor your boundary? Because usually what you will hear is things like, they might get mad at me, I might disappoint somebody, I might not be successful, they might give the project to somebody else, I might not make as much money. So when those things are coming up, just notice them because all of these fears that are showing up, they're all valid. They might not all be true, but they are all valid. And the reason why I say that is these fears come from what is known sort of in the school of psychology as protectors. Protectors are parts of us that want us to be safe, safe and successful. They want us to be safe. And so sometimes they'll show up when we think we're going to be unsafe. And I said from the beginning that the number one reason we're afraid to set boundaries is because we think that it puts us in a state of being unsafe. It's a threat. It creates this perceived threat in our mind. And when we have a perceived threat show up in our brain does everything it needs to do to keep us safe and do it as effectively and as efficiently as possible. That's the brain's job. Keep us alive, do it as efficiently as possible. So of course our protectors are going to show up when something feels unsafe. So if boundaries feel unsafe, of course they're going to show up. Okay, let's talk about where boundaries are often missing. And I'm just going to give you a few examples here that I see. And then I'm just going to go through as I'm giving you those examples and talk about what it is that I think you can start doing to set boundaries there. Okay, so the first one is communication. So with leaders and with entrepreneurs, I see communication as a big one. So what I mean by this is the sense of hypervigilance with communication. It's like you always have to be on your emails or your Slack or your team channels, and you have to be responding like within seconds of getting it, within seconds of getting an email or like a message on Slack or Teams or Asana, whatever you use as your project management tool. You think you need to respond instantly to every one of those messages. And that creates a sense of hypervigilance, or almost like a sense of hypervigilance is whenever your brain is kind of on overdrive. Everywhere you go, you take your phone with you. So even if you're going to the bathroom because you don't want to miss a message. And that is hypervigilance. That's your stress response going on overdrive. And the limiting belief that this creates, a limiting belief is a thought that we have that is not giving us the results we want in the world. The limiting belief that this over communication creates is that I have to immediately respond or I am a bad leader. I have to immediately respond, or that is why I'm such a good leader because I'm so on top of it because I immediately respond. So that in order for me to be successful, I have to always immediately respond. And I just want to put that out there for you because that itself is a thought error. Thought errors are things that we think not on purpose, but by default that are not giving us the results we want in the world. Because if this is a belief that you have, again, pause for a second and think, because is an immediate response really what's making you a successful leader? Probably not. Probably what's making you a successful leader is that you are effective at what you do. You are effective about what you say. That is probably what you are experienced. That is probably what's making you a successful leader because anybody can respond within seconds, but you are the person with the job. And part of that might be because you have timely responses. So timely responses are important, but thinking that you have to respond within seconds, that is the thought error. So you've got to make sure. So here's a boundary that you can set. Get clear with what you expect from people. Get clear, I will respond to emails within 48 hours, or maybe it's 24 hours. I will respond to emails within 24 hours. 24 hours is reasonable. It's not every second, it's not every minute, but it's, within 24 hours. So you block off a time during your day, you get to all your messages. And maybe you have a boundary with emails and a separate boundaries with Teams messages. And the other thing is, it's really important to think about your text messages because I feel like there's this scope creep with text messages because people, instead of just like emailing us, like, oh, they don't respond to my emails, they don't read my emails, I'm just going to text them. text, 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 text. And everyone now wants your cell phone number to text you because they think you don't respond to emails. And it's true, a lot of people aren't responding to emails. Maybe they're trying to create email hygiene or something, but now we're getting bombarded with text. And so just be thoughtful about what you do with those texts, because just because somebody texts you, it doesn't mean you need to respond right away. You can also create a boundary with that. Somebody texting you doesn't automatically mean they have access to your energy. So again, remember, all of this is about protecting your sacred energy. Just because they text you, just because they call you, doesn't mean they have access to your sacred energy. So, and of course, it's a little bit different for emergencies and for other things, but by and large, 90% of what we do are not emergencies. They're not us responding to emergencies. They're the day-to-day things that we do to run our businesses and to lead our teams. So the other thing that's important about this for you to know is that when you are constantly over communicating and like messaging and switching tasks, you're task switching. And there has been studies to show that when you task switch, it makes you 40% less productive because it takes so much time for your mind to go from one task, switch to another task. So every time you task switch in between, it's going to make you less productive and it's going to create decision fatigue because now you're making all these little decisions on things. You're going to feel overwhelmed, you're going to feel exhausted, and you're probably not going to create what you wanted to create that day from a place of intention. All right, so that's over communication. Next one is time hygiene, time. So I call it a time hygiene, but it's really just like time management. And what I mean by this is allowing your calendars to fill up with things that are really non-priority meetings, non-priority things. This one I think is really, really important. And I understand, what I've come to understand is that when most people, what they do is they allow their calendars to just get filled up with stuff. And then whatever's left over, they'll see like, oh, where can I fit in my exercise? Where can I fit in this? Where can I fit in that? And I think it's common, especially if you're new. I remember when I first took on my very first leadership role as a department chair. Geez Louise, is a long time ago. My calendar was bananas, but I had this thought error that I always had to be on. I always had to be available. And so if people wanted to schedule a meeting with me at 8:30 in the morning or 8 in the morning, I'd figure out how to get my kids to daycare. I'd figure all of it out because I needed to be available for work. And I remember this is kind of funny. One of my mentors, who's now the CEO of this large physician organization, and one of my mentors at the beginning when I got asked to take on this job as a medical director and department chair of this large organization, of this large department, my daughter was 10 months old and I was like, no, I can't do it. I have a really young kid. There's no way. And he's like, no, of course you can. Just set boundaries. And I'm laughing because when he said that, I didn't even have a concept. Like I didn't even think I was entitled to set a boundary. So I was like, what do you mean set a boundary? So I'm sharing that because my sense is I'm not alone. I probably am not the only person that had thought that. And so if you feel like you need permission to set boundaries, here is the permission. I'm giving you permission now to just be thoughtful about your time and what you say yes to and what you say no to. So here's what my recommendation is. My recommendation is for you to really understand that there is a limited amount of hours in a day. We have decided in this world that we are running on a 24-hour clock, right? So we run on a 24-hour clock, which means we have limited time in a day. And because we have limited time in a day, we get to decide what we really want to prioritize. And I want to remind you that you let the world know what matters to you, what you value by how you do two things: how you spend your money and how you spend your time. So what would your calendar right now tell you about what matters to you, about what you value? Because I remember, me really, really early on in my career, and I used to say my family was the most important. But had you ever looked at my calendar? Holy smokes, it would tell you such a different story. Such a different story, because the only thing that was ever on my calendar was just work. So here's my recommendation. My recommendation is to start putting things in your calendar based on what you value first. So for example, if you want to block off family time, that's totally appropriate. So once I started practicing these things, I would block off the afternoons from X number of time to this time, 4:30 or 5 o'clock until 8 o'clock. My kids went to bed. That was family time. I wouldn't schedule anything before 9 a.m. because I had to get them ready, had to get them to school. Seems reasonable, right? So, and maybe that's the same thing for you, but maybe for you, you block off lunch because that's when you get, that's when you have a date with your significant other. Who knows? Whatever it is for you. And the other thing is block off stuff for your mental health and your well-being. So I started getting really intentional about I'm going to block off time to go to the gym. I know when I'm doing so I have pretty healthy routines now where I get up in the morning, I meditate, get my kids up, get them to school. I go to the gym and then I get home, get ready, and start my workday. And I make sure that I don't schedule anything before a certain time because that really matters to me. The other thing for me that really matters is having a day to be creative. And so this is my day to be strategic, creative. So I don't schedule any meetings on that day. So for me, that tends to be Monday. So I don't schedule anything before 2 p.m. on a Monday because I want that entire morning to just be a time for creation. It's when I draft podcast episodes, when I'm thinking about big projects and programs. So that's what I'm doing, during my creative time. And if you don't block that time off for yourself, nobody is going to give it to you. So I recommend thinking through those types of things. One other thing you might want to do is you might want to enroll, if you have a virtual assistant or an executive assistant, you might want to enroll them to support you with these types of things. So I have an incredible EA, an incredible executive assistant. She's so awesome. If you're listening, yes, I'm talking about you. Shout out to you. You are amazing. So what she and I, when we first started working together, I was just really clear. I said, here are my parameters. Here's when I'd like to take meetings, when I won't. And again, boundaries are not meant to be rigid. So I told her, if somebody absolutely needs to schedule a meeting during one of my blocked times, just let me know. Send me a text or message me and let me know. And if it's if it's these people, like I'd be happy, or if it's a huge meeting with a huge group of people and it's really hard to work around my blocks, just let me know. I'm happy to, once in a while make exceptions. And so that's what we do. And it's been working out so well. So partner with the folks that are there to support you. They are there to support you. Some of my clients, I have seen these sort of themes where they're afraid that their EA is going to think that they're never available. They're going to make it harder for their EA. But just remember, your EA is there to support you, and you are there to support the larger mission. And so work in partnership with them. You don't want to let those little sneaky thoughts come in and get in the way when it's something that you might just be making up in your mind, might not even be true. All right, so we talked about over communication, we talked about time hygiene, and then the last one is scope creep. So what do I mean by scope creep? This is whenever you are letting clients slide in extra requests without renegotiating terms. Now, this could be a few different ways. It might show up when you're first negotiating a contract, when somebody reaches out to you and says, hey, can you blah, blah, blah? Can you help with something? Or can you, and it doesn't have to be a contract. If you're a leader in an organization, can you take on this project? And you say yes without any parameters. So the parameters is what really, really matters. Setting the parameters in the beginning really matters. Setting those boundaries in the beginning. What are you agreeing to do? What are you agreeing not to do? And if this is, some sort of business arrangement, what is going to be the reimbursement? What are we getting paid for? Get super clear on those expectations early, because when you don't get clear on those expectations early, it leads to resentment, it leads to confusion, and it leads to things being unclear. And remember, being unclear is unkind. So the more clear you can be in the beginning, the better. It's going to make you feel better. It's going to have you come from a higher place energetically because you can trust the other person and then they can trust you. So that's in the very beginning when you're first saying yes to something. Now, if something needs to get added on, I see this happen a lot. If something needs to get added on, there's like a quick text message. Oh, can you do this too? Or there's a quick email. And what doesn't happen sometimes is folks don't pause and say, sure, but let's talk about that. Happy to help. Here is what we would have to add on to that. Here's the extra time I would need, which would mean XYZ. You renegotiate the terms when folks are asking for extra request. The other thing that can sometimes show up with what I'm putting under the bucket of scope creep is if you have clients, especially if your clients are, these individual one-to-one clients. I do a lot of coaching with professional executive global leaders. And if you have clients that sometimes text you, Most of my clients don't, but if you do, and they're texting you off hours, if you have that relationship set up where like, yes, message me, whatever you've agreed to on that contract, that's great. But if it's not agreed upon on that contract and they're messaging you without hours, check your energy, because what's going to happen is your energy is now being encroached upon, and you get to decide what you do with that. And however you respond, you're going to teach them how to treat you. So we teach folks how to treat us, and that's always the same thing with boundaries. If you are constantly responding, they're going to assume you're always going to respond, so they're going to keep messaging you. Same thing with emails. If you're the person that's responding to emails after hours or on the weekends, folks are going to expect that that's just what you do, and they're going to continue to send you messages. But if you shift that energy and say, okay, yeah, I saw that email at like 4:50 on Friday, not urgent, I'll just respond to it on Monday. No big deal. The more you set those boundaries and create those dynamics of how you want to be treated and you respect them, the more people will also respect them. So again, just as a summary here, you want to set sacred time blocks for creation, for rest, for thinking strategically. You want to be thoughtful about the time that you respond to certain messages and emails. Maybe you create a window for responding to your emails or your messages. You want to make sure that when you are saying yes to a project, you are being super clear. You're defining the roles and the expectations. And if they want to renegotiate, you make sure that you renegotiate the terms. So it's about being graceful about yes and, or yes but, or no. It's never about rejection. It's never about rejecting something. It's just about either redirecting or protecting your sacred energy. Okay, so we talked about a lot of stuff. Oh my goodness. We covered what boundaries are, what they're not, why it's important to set them, what's happening in your mind whenever you are letting your energy leak all over the place and how it's draining you, and then where you can start setting boundaries. So one thing that might be helpful for you, if this is either new to you or not new to you, but something you definitely want to start practicing, what I'd love to say is start by naming the things that you feel right now are draining you. Just pause maybe after this episode or pause now. Name the things that drain you. And a good way to sort of be mindful of that is like, what are you feeling resentful about? Where are you feeling extra tired? Those are maybe boundaries that are calling you. Those are places that might be a good place to start setting a boundary. I also would just encourage you to start small. Start small. Choose a small area where it might not be that hard, because setting a boundary in the beginning, if you've never done it before, it's going to take effort. Like anything else, it's going to take a little bit of effort because you've never done it. And so what you are doing now is you are undoing one habit and creating another habit. Changing habits in the beginning takes effort because it's a whole neural pathway that needs to get rewired. So you don't want to start setting boundaries with things that are really hard or complicated. Just start small and practice it. Practice it this week and notice what comes up for you when you practice. And you want to anchor your boundaries on your values. Remember, boundaries protect your vision, your mission, the impact you want to have in the world. You don't want you don't want anything to take away from that. You want things to protect that. And the other thing that's really beautiful when you start doing this is you also get to practice trusting yourself. And in my experience, one of the most important things I do with everybody I work with is I walk them home back to themselves, where they can now come from such a strong place of authentic power. And that is all about trusting yourself. This is where you can start leaving imposter syndrome outside, because now you trust yourself. And if your nervous system starts to flare up, if you are noticing that you're setting these boundaries and you're feeling dysregulated or nervous or afraid or anxious, maybe you become, your heart rate starts to race or your palms feel sweaty. Those are all indicators that your nervous system is flaring up. Maybe you feel a knot in your stomach, whatever it is that you feel when your nervous system flares up. Remember, that's normal. It's normal in the beginning for that to happen, because boundaries sometimes signal unsafety, and unsafety is a perceived threat, which turns on the same exact stress response as if we were an actual threat, if we're being chased by a bear. So if that starts to happen to you, I want you to just pause for a second, and I want you to practice regulating yourself. So you're going to pause, notice the dysregulation, pause, breathe into it. 5 seconds inhale, hold your breath. 5 seconds slow exhale, and you regulate your body and you remind yourself, this is just a protector. I'm actually safe. And this is for the highest and greatest good of all, of myself and of everybody else, of the people that I'm serving, of my teams, of my family. Setting these boundaries are for the highest and greatest good of all. All right, sweet friends, I hope that was helpful. We asked a lot of questions, and I hope you are now able to set boundaries or at least start practicing them. If you found this episode helpful, I would love for you to leave a review. Maybe you can leave your takeaway in the review there. It really helps others find us. All right, sweet friends, I will see you next week. Adios.